Spending some time reconnecting with nature this summer? Here's a camping hack from LL Bean to make your next trip the best yet. When putting together your gear, wrap a piece of duct tape around your water bottle. It's barely noticeable, but if another piece of gear breaks or tears, pull off your tape to make a quick patch or repair. For more camping hacks, visit youtube.com/LLbean. LL Bean. Be an outsider.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Final Four is Not on the Schedule. I'm your host Eric, alongside with expert analyst Rod. Thanks for joining us on the best MSU basketball podcast featuring in-depth recruiting, game matchup, and post-game analysis. We dive deep to give you the best tools to enjoy the Spartans and impress your friends and family. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod. We're here for our rankings of the Big Ten. This time it's going to be ranking the history and traditions of the programs from 1 to 14, obviously. And so before we begin, I just want to remind you again to continue supporting the show. You can go leave a review. A written review is the best. It helps the podcast aggregators. That way they can find us either on Spotify or on YouTube or certainly on your Apple Podcasts. So stop, give us a 5-star rating. Leave a little thing saying great podcast or whatever it is. We appreciate that. And that will help more people find the show, and that will help us continue to grow. So let's begin here. We're going to start again, as we've been doing in the past, from worst to best tradition in history. And I'll go through the list and then we'll talk about it specifically. So go Northwestern, Nebraska, Rutgers, Penn State, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Maryland, Purdue, Michigan, Ohio State, Michigan State, and Indiana. And so let's begin with number 14, Northwestern, which you have as the worst history and tradition, which I think is kind of obvious since they don't make very frequent stops in the NCAA tournament.
Well, here's the big debate, and this is very much open for debate. So I'll be interested in your opinion as well. I've got Northwestern 14th, Nebraska 13th. Northwestern has only made the NCAA tournament twice, and both of those coming within the last decade. Nebraska has made it. I need to check this. I want to say 7 times,
4 or 5 times.
No, I think it's more than that.
Could be.
But here's the difference in Northwestern's favor. Northwestern's actually won some games in the NCAA tournament. Both times they've made it, they've won games. Yeah, Nebraska has had 7 tournament appearances. The most recent one in 2014. They've never won an NCAA tournament game. Their last conference regular season championship was in 1950. Now, granted, I believe that's more recent than Northwestern's, but still. So it really comes down to, and there's an argument both ways. If someone wanted to say, hey, the fact that Northwestern's actually won some tournament games, to me, trumps the 7-2 advantage in appearances for Nebraska. It's okay. There's a reasonable argument to that. I went the other direction. I think it's hard to argue that a team that's only been to the tournament twice is anything but the worst in terms of tradition. But there's an argument
from a major conference, right? That's
from a
Power 5 conference,
sure.
Yeah.
Where it's important to note that at least for the last 35 years or so, basically, if you can be a 500 team in your conference, you got a reasonable shot as a Big Ten member at making the tournament. It's not as if you got to win the league.
Right, yeah.
So I don't know. That's how I came out, but I'm open to other arguments. How do you feel about it? Do you agree that the 7-2 advantage in tournament appearances outweighs the whatever it is for Northwestern? 2 victories, I think, to none.
Yeah, it's hard because there's that recency bias, right? And you definitely feel like, well, Northwestern's on the move. You could argue the same about Nebraska, I guess, in some respects, and it's hard too because Nebraska has been really, really atrocious since they've joined the Big Ten. I mean, they have never been really competitive.
They had a brief period with Tim Miles,
flash in the pan. They've sort
this
of
year with Fred Hoiberg, they were competitive, and that's really it.
Yeah, but even competitive, they're still not winning half their
Right,
games,
or
right?
9
I
and
mean,
11.
at least
Yeah.
with Hoiberg, yeah. And then they were in the Big 12, Big 8, whatever it was, going back forever. And I sort of feel like, boy, in that era, you should have been able to make the tournament more than just a couple times for us, if there weren't that many teams in your league. So in some ways, I think Nebraska's got a worse tradition only because I feel like Northwestern is oftentimes an afterthought, which maybe makes it that maybe they are worst tradition history if I don't even think about them. But they were so bad. I mean, so bad for so long to the point where, I mean, they were never, ever competitive. And I guess you could argue Nebraska occasionally was. Like they'd have a year here and there where they were good to make those, to get those, tournament bids. Whereas Northwestern, I mean, until recently, they've been a perennial doormat. So I think probably you're right in where you have them. But I think it depends. If you have a long tradition in the Big 12, you may say, boy, Nebraska, they were a doormat forever for us too. So
Yeah, it's a
I don't
hard
know.
one. But that was my rationale.
Yeah, no, I think it's right. And with all these things, it's splitting hairs and just how you rank various
Yeah.
components. What's more important. Well, then, I mean, I guess it goes to Nebraska. I guess there's not much more to say about it except that they have, especially recently, been pretty poor and worse under Hoiberg than even under Tim Miles.
Absolutely.
But they've never really challenged from the Big. I will say this about Nebraska that I did not expect to say about Nebraska when they joined the Big Ten, is they are a more interesting basketball program than they were when they joined. Like when
Yes.
they joined, it was like their swim program. Like you don't even think about them. But now you at least like, oh, at least you get the impression that their fans care. Yep. And you can't say about every team in the Big Ten.
Correct.
But certainly Nebraska fans, they seem to care. They stink, but they seem to care and actually show up and have enthusiasm. And so to that respect, I mean, my hat's off to them for supporting a team that's really crummy. So I don't know. I mean, I think that this may change. I would
agree with that.
I feel they may not stay 13th.
I would agree with that.
So I guess we just move down to number 12, which is Rutgers. And this is a team that, boy, they have truly no tradition pre-Big Ten and not really much post-Big Ten, but I guess they've started to show some signs of life here recently. But
well, here's the separator. So they've actually made the NCAA tournament 8 times. And they've got a Final Four to their credit, 1976. They have 2 Sweet 16s. Okay. So there is some history of success. It's not a lot, but there's some, and more than Nebraska and Northwestern have. So they pretty clearly they rated a level above those 2 programs to me. I didn't have difficulty separating them out for that reason, because of that Final Four. To me, and it's not, some of these things, it's not a Final Four in 1942. When the NIT was arguably a more prestigious tournament. It's 1976. It's the modern or modern-ish era. And so you can respect it. So that to me is what separates them out.
All right, number 11, Penn State. And I feel like, well, I guess you'll go through the reasons, but I mean, the last time Penn State was had any sort of history is way back when Crispin was playing, and that was I feel like 20 plus years ago.
Yeah. Here's the thing. Again, it's debatable. They've had 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 NCAA tournament appearances. But in fairness to them, half of those have come since 1990. So it's not as if it's all ancient. They've got 1 Final Four, 1954, 2 Elite Eights, 4 Sweet 16s, one of which was in 2001. You could debate this one vis-a-vis Rutgers. I think there's a discussion there, but I give Penn State the edge because of the having more NCAA tournament appearances. But it's close. I mean, it's not a stellar history. There's, that much is clear. Either way, we're talking about, programs that don't have great basketball history by Big Ten standards. But, those are my reasons why.
It's interesting because I feel like at least with Penn State, their excuse is, well, we're a football school. Whereas Rutgers, I don't know and Rutgers is not a football school either. I don't know what Rutgers, I guess they're just a state university for New Jersey is pretty much, I think that was their name for a while too, until somewhat recently. So anyway, so before we go to the next grouping, we'll take a brief stop and just talk about Nudge Printing. Nudge Printing is our sponsor, longtime sponsor for the show. They have high quality screen printed apparel, very breathable, wearable, washable. You can wash it a million times. It still looks just great as when you first purchase it. They are the favorite t-shirts of my family. My wife and daughter wear them all the time. My wife when she's working out, walking around, or doing stuff. I wore them when I won the free throw competition at Michigan State and my tickets to the Final Four. So both that, and I also wore the hoodie, which is fantastic. You can get those actually logoed gear, which all the proceeds go and support our show. So if you want to support our show and wear some really cool Spartan stuff with our really cool logo, you can go to the Final Four schedule.com/merchandise, and there you can click on that. But also, once you click through there, you can also buy anything else at Nudge. So you can add that to your order. You can get 20% off by entering the code Final4 at checkout. And there's also all kinds of other opportunities to buy other stuff from Nudge Printing, not just Michigan State stuff. You can other schools in the state of Michigan and other non-apparel things, all high quality, made in Michigan by Michigan State alums. Brett, Gabe, and Brittany can't go wrong. So again, that's nudgeprinting.com and check it out. You won't regret it. Okay. So number 10, the Golden Gophers from Minnesota.
Yeah. And I think again, here it's tough. Not a huge amount of success. One Final Four in 1997, and that's actually been vacated, but I'm going to count it. 2 Elite Eights, 4 Sweet 16s. They've only won 3 Big Ten championships since World War II.
That's hard to believe because
72, 82, and 97. And again, 97 was vacated. But the reason I've got them over these other schools we mentioned, that they do have the Final Four. They've got 2 Elite Eights, 4 Sweet 16s, and they've also got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 14 NCAA tournament appearances. So I think they clear Rutgers and the Penn State and the programs below them, not by a lot, but by enough. I would say, honestly, in my opinion, I would rate Minnesota as maybe the all-time underachiever in Big Ten basketball history, because especially in the last 25 years or so, it's a good talent producing state. I've talked about this many times in various contexts on this podcast. If you just keep the vast majority of in-state talent home, you could have a very, very good program. They used to be able to do that, but ironically, since the state has started producing more talent, they've been less successful in doing that. So that's what's got to change. But it was surprising to me to see that Big Ten title fact. I wouldn't have guessed it was only 3 since World War II. That's a pretty stark, and frankly, even if you include the vacated title in 97, I mean, that's what, 26 years now? That's a long time.
And you could almost say 26 years really since they've been good. I mean, they've not been really,
they've
had
good. They've had the occasional team like in 2019, Michigan State beat them in the second round. That was a good Minnesota team, but it wasn't a great one. Been a long time since they've had a great one.
Yeah, and it just exemplifies, just looking at the last 2, Minnesota and Penn State, you add them together, their tournament appearances, it's less than Michigan State's current streak, which is really startling. I mean, I think it's easy to forget how long the streak has been at 25 years now for Michigan State. So, and how dominant the Spartans have been in the Big Ten play. So moving on to number 9, the Iowa Hawkeyes, a program that was, in some ways, I think they're very similar to Minnesota in that sort of they are, except they've had more success recently than Minnesota has, certainly. But they were really good and had some really great teams in the 80s, but not a lot of huge postseason success. But they were, the fans care about basketball. Maybe not. They're still generally a football school, but they do care about basketball. And there's definitely some tradition, but it's not a whole lot different. Again, it's not a whole lot different than Minnesota.
I do think there's a clear separator between Iowa and Minnesota, though. First of all, they've been to the tournament 29 times.
Right. Yeah.
That's pretty good. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Sweet 16 performances, although none since 99. 4 Elite Eights. Last time there was 87. And 3 Final Fours. The last time there was 1980. Mm-hmm. They've never won a national championship. But so to me, Iowa pretty clearly rates ahead of Minnesota and everybody below them. I mean, 29 tournament appearances is a lot. Yeah. You know, that's a pretty decent number. You know, they have multiple Final Fours. They've had, you know, a decent amount of Sweet 16s. I mean, there's been some level of success, not nearly enough to get them on the level of the upper tier teams we're going to talk about, but enough to put them ahead of these teams below them. I think there's a clear demarcation point with them.
Sure. Yeah, I'll buy that. And that moves us to our next team, the Badgers from Wisconsin, who, you know, we're talking about history and tradition. I feel like, and it's not borne out by the stats, but certainly Wisconsin, very similar to Northwestern until recently. And by recently, I mean the last, say, 30 years or so, or whatever, 35 years, that they were really not much of anything in basketball. And it was only during that last 3-4 decades that they've suddenly built a history and a tradition at the school.
I think the recency effect separates them from Iowa because the resumes are pretty similar. 26 tournament appearances, but the vast majority of those, in fact, all but since 1994, 24 of the 26 have come from 1994 on. So that says a lot, right? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Sweet 16 performances, all of which have come from 2000 on.
Yeah.
They've got 6 Elite Eights, 4 of those from 2000 on. 4 Final Fours, 3 of which have been from 2000 on. And then they have an NCAA runner-up in 2015 where they lost to Duke with that great Frank Kaminsky-led team. Again, recency effect is part of this, but it's also true that it's been in recent years that they've accumulated so much. I mean, you could say the same thing to some, maybe a little bit lesser extent, but Michigan State's resume looks that way.
It's similar.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree.
It doesn't invalidate it. I mean, over a 30-year period, that's long enough to say, well, that's a big chunk of time.
And Wisconsin, right? 2 generations.
Right. And Wisconsin's been very, very good over that period of time. There's no arguing with that. So I put them here. Again, they don't have a national title, which many of the programs, not all, but many of the programs ahead of them do. And they don't have quite the same level of success as overall as some of these other programs we're going to talk about have, but it's still a very rich history. So we're starting to get into the range of programs we're discussing where there's really a lot under their belts.
Yeah, some level of success, at least. That's Well, and the next is number 7. So we move into the front half of the list. It'd be Fighting Illini from Illinois, who have, especially recently now, been coming back a little bit, but they've definitely had a long history of successful teams in basketball tradition.
And this is a tough one with Wisconsin. There are arguments you can make, but Illinois has 33 NCAA tournament appearances. They've got 11 Sweet 16s and 8 of those since 1981. They have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Elite Eights. They've got 5 Final Fours, only 2 of which have come since 1952, though. So if you want to downgrade them, there's that. And they also, like Wisconsin, have 1 NCAA tournament runner-up performance. Their great 2005 team which lost to North Carolina, which I actually think was probably the best team in the country that year. They just didn't win it. But it's a great look. It's a great history. There's what they're lacking, what prevents Illinois from getting into the discussion with the truly elite programs in the conference is the lack of a national title is one thing. They can't match many of the others in terms of the number of Final Fours. That gets tougher with only 5. And frankly, Big Ten regular season championships, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, only 7 since 1963.
And those do include ties as well, right? So
that's
it's not
right.
Like
that's right.
Right. So that
Tom Izzo's got more than that.
Yeah. Right.
So that's a little bit, again, you started getting into these comparisons and you end up splitting hairs. But I do think that's an important point to note as to why I have them only where they are, because by national standards, Illinois has got very rich basketball tradition.
And so then number 6, the Maryland Terrapins, who actually do have a national championship, although they were not a Big Ten team at the time. They did in the 2000s.
That's right. And so we're talking about their history, obviously, not just in the Big Ten. This is
Correct.
one people could argue with me about vis-a-vis Illinois. 30 NCAA tournament appearances, so they're below Illinois there. Now, where they trump them is Sweet 16s. They've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 14 Sweet 16s. They've got 4 Elite Eights, only 2 Final Fours, although they came in 2001 and 2002. But to me, what gives them the edge is that national championship in 2002. I mean, it's a close call. The negative for Maryland too, and again, almost all of this history is in the ACC. They've only won 7 conference championships in their entire history, and only 1 since joining the Big Ten. But I mean, there's just not a lot of conference championships. But when you play in a league with North Carolina and Duke, it's going to be tough, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's some of it. But this is where you can start having these discussions about what you prioritize and what you value, because you can make an argument that Illinois maybe has a little better case in a lot of other areas, but they don't have that national title, and Maryland does. So that's, to me, why Maryland checks in just a little bit ahead of them. But again, reasonable minds can differ on that front. It's just where I landed.
And speaking of teams that have not won a national championship, we'll go to the Purdue Boilermakers, who are number 5, ranked right ahead of Maryland. This
program, its history, really, it comes down to what do you value? Because in almost every respect, Purdue just sits in a great position when you look at their history. 33 NCAA tournament appearances. They got a boatload of conference championships. I mean, I count 4, 8, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 25 Big Ten regular season titles,
which I believe
is number 1. I believe that's still number 1, and I'm pretty sure they've also won the most Big Ten games of any program, right?
Could be.
Boatload.
Yeah,
they've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13 Sweet 16 performances. They've got 5 Elite Eights. Where they come up short is there's only 2 Final Fours, the last one coming in 1980, and 1 NCAA tournament runner-up to, I believe, to UCLA in 1969. That's it. They don't have the NCAA tournament title, and to only have 2 Final Fours, it certainly brings them up short in that regard as well. So you can have the argument, I mean, it really comes down to what do you value most? You can make a good case that Purdue has been over time the most consistently good program in Big Ten history. And it's tough to argue with that. There's never a long period of time where they're not winning Big Ten championships. They go to the NCAA tournament a ton. They've had decent success over the course of history, at least when they've been there, but they just haven't been able to break through in the big moments. And so how do you evaluate that?
Yeah.
I think it's a fair question, but that's where I land.
Well, and that's how you separate from the next team, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But the brothers at Just Do Gutters, if you need gutter work done in the state of Michigan, take care of those leaves that are always falling on your roof. And if you're like me and hate getting up on ladders, especially 3 stories up, it's something I don't even consider. Get those leaf guards on. They can also clean out your gutters if you need it, or they can repair or replace them. They're specialists, and that's all they do. Just do gutter work. You can get a hold of Kurt and his team on the west side of the state in the Grand Rapids area, or Greg and his team on the east side of the state in Detroit metropolitan area, Oakland County. They will set you up. They'll take care of all that water problem that you have. And if you're thinking about it or looking up and see leaky gutters and you need something done, have them come by and get you a quote. 10% off if you mention Final Four when you reach out to them. You can find contact information in your podcast player, or you can go to our website and find it on the description of the show at the finalfoursoontheschedule.com. Again, you're not going to regret getting a hold of those guys to take care of your problems with your gutters. So the number 4 team is the Michigan Wolverines. They obviously have a national title. They have a long, it's funny because they have a long tradition in some ways, although I feel like their fans don't care so much about it, but they do definitely have a lot of tradition of success within college basketball, both in the Big Ten and then in the national NCAA tournament as well.
Yeah. 30 NCAA tournament appearances, 8 Final Fours, 1 national title. They've been runner up. So they've lost in the final 6 times.
It's hard to believe it's that many times.
Yeah.
They always win their Final Four game.
Yeah. Well, that's right. So seven, there's only been one of those 8 appearances that they didn't win a game. And it was the first one in 1964. Every Final Four they've made since then, they've won at least the semifinal, but they've only been able to get over the hump once, and win the whole thing. And honestly, I think you can make some arguments with them and Ohio State. I don't think you can make arguments with the top 2, because at this level, everybody we're talking about has a boatload of NCAA tournament appearances. They've got a boatload of Final Fours. So when you get to that level, to me at least, it really then comes down to how many titles have you won? And they've only got one.
This from Purdue, right? For you,
right.
This is what makes them better than
right.
Purdue.
But that's why I give them the edge over Purdue. Exactly right. Mm-hmm. Because Purdue would outdo Michigan on a lot of other levels. Big Ten championships for sure. They'd leave them in the dust. And they've got more NCAA tournament appearances, a few more. But they lack that title and they lack those Final Fours. Michigan's got them 8-2 in Final Fours. They've got a 1-0 in titles. So that's the separator there. The case between Michigan and Ohio State is a very close one. I give Ohio State the edge for a couple reasons, which we'll get into in a second, but it's close.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the number 3, the Buckeyes, who, it's funny. I think Thad Matta and that they were successful, but I forget that they were also very successful before too. And so they've always had good teams. Again, football school, they don't really care that much about basketball, but they are able to field really good teams.
Well, look, here's the bottom line. Their 1 national title came in 1960. Okay, that was the Jerry Lucas, John Havlicek era. Bob Knight was the 6th man on that team. They've got 11 Final Fours. Okay, that gives them an edge over Michigan. Mm-hmm. They've got 1 national title, which ties them with Michigan. They've also got 35 NCAA tournament appearances to Michigan's 30. So that also gives them an edge. So I think it's a close call, but that's why I give them the edge for the number 3 spot. But also the fact that they've only got the 1 national title is what keeps them from being higher than 3rd, in my opinion.
What is the number of Big Ten championships with Ohio State versus Michigan? Do you have that in front of you?
I'd have to look at it. Let's see.
So I feel like Ohio State has more than Michigan. I just feel like Michigan's in the Big Ten a whole lot, but that's just recency.
I think I think that may well be true, because Ohio State does have several. Michigan doesn't have a ton. They've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Michigan's got 15, but of course, 4 of those are pre-World War II. Um,
Oh,
so they've got 15, and I think Ohio State trumps that, but we will see.
that's interesting. They only have 10 since the World War II. I would have
Yeah.
expected more than that, even though I didn't. That's a long time they weren't very good, I guess, during the 60s and such.
Ohio State's got 22.
Oh yeah, so not even
And
close. Yeah,
all but 4 of those, so 18 of them have come post World War II.
yeah. So
So pretty decisive edge.
yeah, and that's what it feels like too. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, and Ohio State's done it. Both of those schools have done it. They've had accomplishments under multiple coaches in multiple eras. That's definitely true. But yeah, it's pretty striking that these two schools that you don't feel have a particularly. I mean, if there was justice in the world, Illinois and Purdue would rate higher than Ohio State and Michigan.
Yeah,
because those schools, their fan bases, I think, care about the sport more, but there's no justice in the world. So it doesn't work out that way.
That's always been the case. Got to go out there and win. So then moving to number 2, the Michigan State Spartans. Obviously, as we just kind of alluded to earlier, that the tradition has changed. I mean, Michigan State is much more of a recent tradition of success, but it's still like, I don't know.
But it's so
18
overwhelming.
years for a generation. It's like 2 generations worth now of good teams they've been fielding. So you can kind of say at this point, it's a long tradition.
Here's the other thing too with some of these numbers I'm going to throw at you. Let's remember Michigan State doesn't get into the Big Ten until the early 50s. So some of those Big Ten titles I've mentioned for these other programs, they happened in 1919. Right. Michigan State couldn't compete for those. MSU's got 36 NCAA tournament appearances.
So more than anyone you've mentioned so far.
That's right. They've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 16 Big Ten regular season championships, 10 of which, 10 of which have come under Tom Izzo.
Yeah.
So that trumps, it's, you can see
that's
what
more
the
than anyone
deal
else,
is here.
any other team. Yeah.
Last 10 Final Fours. So 1 fewer than Ohio State, 2 more than Michigan. But here's what ultimately puts them at number 2 instead of lower: 2 national titles.
Right.
And that's just it. I mean, we've only got, for as great a basketball conference as the Big Ten is, there are only 2 schools in it that have multiple national titles. Right. And Michigan State's one of them. I think that, this is an obvious statement, but what will need to happen to solidify Michigan State's status going forward is what comes after Tom Izzo. If you look at, we just talked about Michigan and Ohio State, and they've had great success over multiple periods of time. Purdue, they're although lacking in tournament success, but you get my meaning. Same thing. Indiana, mostly under Bob Knight, but not exclusively. They've had other periods of success. So when you think about the great, and Izzo has talked about this many, many times, how if you want to be a blue blood, it can't be about just one guy. If you look at North Carolina, you look at Kansas, you look at Kentucky, it's UCLA even to some extent. It's multiple guys, multiple eras over time, multiple teams. And so that's what's going to have to happen to keep Michigan State where it currently sits. I feel very confident putting Michigan State number 2 in the league. I think it's justified entirely, being as objective as I can. To me, the 2 national titles are the separator between MSU and Ohio State and Michigan. That's what separates them. And they've got more NCAA tournament appearances than either of those schools too. Yeah. Marginal advantage, but still over the same period of time, since Michigan State's been a Big Ten member, they're ahead of Michigan in Big Ten titles. And I think they're right there with Ohio State. So, all those things speak well to the accomplishments of the program. And they have done something, they had 2 Final Fours before Tom Izzo. So it's not like they had nothing. We talked about a program like Purdue, all time only has two.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, the one in 57 and then Judd Heathcote's in 79, that alone will put them on par with most of the rest of the league historically. The fact that Tom Izzo's come in and added 8 to that, well, that eclipses everybody else. But those are the arguments. Again, I feel pretty safe and secure in making them.
Well, then we'll finish off with the Hoosiers from Indiana. Obviously, a long time of success and the last. I think they still are the last team to have a perfect season, right?
Yes, correct.
Which is kind of shocking that's. I mean, I guess you play more games now, so maybe it's a little harder to do. And it certainly felt like that. Was it Memphis or the Kentucky? I can't remember. Memphis team that was undefeated and then lost in the finals. It was
the
Kentucky.
Last team to sort of. It was Kentucky.
Yeah, they're the
they
last
got beat
team
by
to
Wisconsin.
Lose.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Look, it's Indiana. 41 NCAA tournament appearances. So they're tops in the conference in that category. They're second to Purdue in Big Ten titles. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 22 of them. Mm-hmm. They've been to, now this is where you can make the argument. They've only been to 8 Final Fours. So Michigan State's got 2 more Final Fours than IU has.
I mean, Tom Izzo has 8.
Tom Izzo has as many as Indiana does. But Indiana has 5 titles. And that's what that and the NCAA tournament appearances and the Big Ten championships is what pretty clearly puts them alone at number 1 to me. It would be very hard to be a Purdue Boilermaker fan because you can look at the regular season track record of the 2 programs, and there's a very strong case that Purdue's actually been better over history. They've got more Big Ten titles. They've won more Big Ten games. They've been better. But it just gets washed away when you start looking at the postseason.
Yeah.
And that's where the edge is. And it's a decisive edge. It's a decisive edge between IU and anybody else in the national title realm. I mean, 5 of them. That's one of the best marks. I'm trying to think who eclipses that historically. It's UCLA and Kentucky, and I think that's it. I don't think anybody else has more. Kansas maybe is tied. Duke is tied, I think, and maybe UConn now. I'd have to go back and see whether UConn's got 4 or 5, but it's pretty impressive, and there's a reason why, I think for people who are, let's say, I don't know, 35 and younger, it might be hard for them to fully relate to why older people still view Indiana the way they do. And I'll speak for myself, the way I do, because Indiana's been an okay program for about 25 years. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot. Just like we've talked about Michigan State and Wisconsin, hey, that's a generation that counts, where they've been really, really good. Well, it's about a generation where Indiana's been kind of, they've been okay, but they haven't been great.
They don't strike fear in you though.
No. Yeah. And have they been that much better than, say, Iowa? I don't think so. I mean, they do have one Final Four and NCAA national championship game appearance during that time. So that helps their case a little bit, but by and large, they haven't been a great program for a long time. But man, when you look at the history of it, and we're not talking ancient history, we're not talking Michigan football victories here. We're talking, stuff that was on color TV, let's say.
Right.
It's really impressive. And so I can't make it would be, I would have to be the homer of homers to try to make a case for Michigan State above Indiana historically. Now, if Tom Izzo can tack on another couple national titles before he's done, well, then maybe we could start having a discussion, because I do think Tom Izzo is getting to the point where you're going to have to seriously evaluate whether he eclipses Knight as the best Big Ten coach of all time. I think if and when he passes Knight's total Big Ten conference victories, I think that becomes a clear cut. I think he does win it. Knight would have the edge in national titles, at least right now, but Izzo's got way more Final Fours. He's got more Big Ten championships. He will have won more Big Ten games. I mean, I think the argument will be pretty good in Tom Izzo's favor at that point. But program histories, I still think you got to give it to IU.
Yeah, no, I think so. And for those curious, those salty Purdue fans, I just looking up, they're 125-90 in their head-to-head against Indiana. But
there's another reason, right? So huge
when it counts,
35 game advantage in the head-to-head. That's got to be really tough to take, because the difference comes down to them. Well, what did you do when it was one and done time? What did you do when the chips were down and you didn't have a tomorrow if you lost? And that's where Purdue has just absolutely folded historically compared to IU.
Yeah. I mean, we all remember Katie, right? He could not win in the postseason. He would get great teams, you know?
Oh yeah. I mean, I would make an argument that year to year consistency for the 80s and 90s, there was no better program in the league than Purdue. Just year to year in, year out. Are they going to be good? Yeah. The answer was almost always yes. But they just, even when they had, so they have Glenn Robinson, one of the great players in Big Ten history. Unfortunately, he happens to come along at a time where Michigan has the Fab Five and Indiana had great teams too. And Ohio State had Jimmy Jackson. So even then, even when they had the superstar, which they don't always have, it just wasn't going to be enough.
There's no I in team, but there is one in Indeed, and that's the hiring platform that you need to build yours. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, Indeed's a powerful hiring platform that can help you do it all. One of the things I love about Indeed is that it makes hiring all in one place so easy, because Indeed does the hard work for you. They show you the candidates whose resumes on Indeed fit your description immediately after you post, so you can hire faster. Join more than 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/Blue Wire Sports. Offer good for a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/Blue Wire Sports. That's Indeed.com/Blue Wire Sports, and support the show by saying that you heard it on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire Sports. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
What's up? It's Kaylee Cuoco. When it comes to travel, we all have a happy place. I just went to my happy place. I just went to Maui, and it was truly amazing. Priceline has always been about getting you to your happy place for a happy price, with deals you really can't find anywhere else. Like up to 60% off select hotels in Costa Rica, or 5-star hotels for 2-star prices in Cabo.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
So, I think when you look at the legacy of Izzo and the Big Ten, and, but if compared to Bobby Knight, when you're comparing Michigan State and Indiana, undoubtedly Izzo is much more beloved by the media and by fans than Bob Knight ever was or ever will be. Certainly after the way Bob Knight's career collapsed at the end, and sort of the way he sort of was forced out. And so Izzo will be celebrated much more than Bob Knight. I don't think there's any question. But for Michigan State to pass Indiana in this, do they need, in your opinion, if they get to, let's say they win 2 more titles and they have 4 instead of Indiana's 5, but they probably have 2 or 3 more Final Four appearances, they probably have some more Big Ten appearances. I mean, if Izzo were to somehow pull that off in the next 3 to 4 years, win 2 more titles, let's say, which I don't know how likely that is, but would that be enough, do you think, to propel Michigan State, or do you think it requires them to pass the torch to the next person and to still maintain some level of consistency to say we've got that tradition?
Yeah, that's a good argument. I mean, I think you also have to assume that Indiana continues not doing great things. That they're not adding to their resume. But yeah, that would be, look, I think if Izzo did that, yes, you would then have the historical accomplishments to have that be an argument. Because MSU would trump Indiana in terms of Final Fours pretty clearly. They're reasonably close in NCAA tournament appearances. I mean, it's 41-36. It's not a huge gap.
Yeah.
And Big Ten titles, at least during the era that Michigan State was actually a member, is very tight as well. So you would have that argument, but it would be a reasonable response for someone to say, you know what, if you're talking all time, let's see what the next guy does. Because it's also fair to say, if we stop the clock with Indiana at, say, 1995, they look even better.
Oh yeah. If anything, that they've degraded it. Sort of
some of the luster has
right?
worn off. Yeah. So that would be a fair thing to say to me. If someone would say, well, we got to see what the next guy does. If you're talking historical perspectives.
It is also interesting too, if you now throw next year, would have to add USC and UCLA. Clearly USC is, towards the bottom. They have almost no tradition in basketball. UCLA, of course, has lots of tradition.
Yeah.
A recent victory, a national championship. And then, of course, the big string that Wooden put together back in the 60s, right? So would they be first in the Big Ten?
Yeah, they'd have to be. And that'd be a tough thing. It's like, what?
Tough pill to swallow,
they
right?
just joined.
The guy comes like, oh, by the way, we're the best.
But they would, because the Wooden run of titles is unprecedented. Nobody's going to ever touch that, in my opinion.
No.
And look, the thing is, well, you can argue they haven't stayed at that level. Who has? They've still been pretty damn good over. It's not like, right. It's not like UCLA has fallen off the map. As recently as the aughts, they had a run of 3 straight Final Fours. They made a Final Four. What was it? 3 years ago? 2 years ago, the COVID year. Yeah. So, I mean, they're still pretty good, but yeah, I think the Wooden titles you'd have to, but that's the point. Then these discussions start to become a little ludicrous. It's like, well, what are we really evaluating? It feels that way to some extent with Maryland too, because Maryland's only been in the league, a decade or so. Most of their accomplishments, including their national title and both of their Final Fours, came in the ACC. But I've got to somehow factor that in with Big Ten schools that they didn't compete against for all but the last decade. It becomes a more difficult discussion to have. But yes, I think, let's put it this way. Generally speaking, I think there's a pretty clear-cut blue blood 5. And it's Duke, Kansas, Kentucky, North Carolina, and UCLA. I don't think you can argue with any of those. Historically, Indiana has been viewed as the 6th member of that group. There seems to be a view that they might be slipping out of it because of what we talked about, the lack of consistent success over the last quarter century. I would still be inclined to put them in that category, but I can understand the debate. If someone wants to say they're just outside of it and they're number 6, I'm not going to argue with that. But yeah, UCLA would clearly be ahead of them. I don't think there's any doubt about that. You just can't argue with the national titles.
No. And I think that the tricky thing, and this is a time zone bias that you just, when it comes to West Coast basketball or athletics really in general, they just don't have the exposure, and it's easy to forget about them. And and I feel like UCLA in some respects, Arizona just has seemed like a bigger brand out in the Pac-10 or Pac-12 or whatever it is now than UCLA in some ways. Not maybe the last couple of years, but I just feel like Arizona's hyped more than UCLA.
Well, there have been periods of time, certainly over the last 30 years, where Arizona has been very much a peer of UCLA's. I would go that far.
Sure. Yeah.
But you're right about having lived out there for a period of time. I agree. And it also doesn't help that for a variety of reasons, the populations in that part of the country don't care about college athletics in the same way that they do in the Midwest or the South. That's just a fact. I mean, I don't think you can even argue that. Having been in the Bay Area for a while, yeah, college sports are around, but it's just not the same thing as it is here. And so that bleeds into it too.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see what happens, obviously, when those teams, when those schools join the Big Ten, to see if that changes, if the exposure with the East Coast market helps raise their profile, their brand too. I imagine it would quite a bit, playing, not at 10 p.m. all the time, at least certainly when they're on the road. But that'll be discussion for, I guess, another day. Before we go, I just want to remind you again, if you want to support the show, go to the Final Four on the schedule.com/support. You can also head on over to the Brothers That Just Do Gutters at thebrothersgutters.com. Enter in your zip code. You will find your local dealer. If it's either Greg in the Southeast Michigan side or Kurt on the West side, get a hold of them. 10% off if you mention Final Four. And Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. They can take care of all your printing needs. They also even do custom shirts. If you have a fundraiser, you can check out that. The link is on their website as well. That's at nudgeprinting.com. Again, and 20% off if you say Final Four at the coupon code for the checking out. But until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.
Thank you.